بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to episode 8 of the Salah series. In this episode we'll take what Hudayfa radiallahu anhu narrates, this incident, the story that Hudayfa radiallahu anhu shares with us. He said, I prayed with the Prophet ﷺ one night. This is the Prophet ﷺ praying qiyam, praying extra voluntary prayer at night. So Hudayfa radiallahu anhu is saying, I prayed with the Prophet ﷺ one night. So he started off in the first rak'ah reciting Surah Al-Baqarah. So Hudayfa is thinking to himself, he said, he'll go into ruku' after 100. So basically he'll recite 100 verses from Surah Al-Baqarah in the first rak'ah, then he'll go do ruku'. But the Prophet ﷺ, when he got to 100 verse, he continued. He passed the 100th verse of Surah Al-Baqarah and continued. So Hudayfa is thinking again for himself. He said, maybe he'll complete Surah Al-Baqarah in the first rak'ah and then go into ruku'. But he continued. He finished Surah Al-Baqarah, continued, reciting, and started with Surah An-Nisa, and he recited the whole thing. Then he started Surah Ali Imran, and he continued the whole thing, until he finished it. And Hudayfa is describing the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ in his recitation. He said he is reciting mutarassila, yaqra'u mutarassila. He's reciting in a very, not in a rush. In other words, he's taking his time. And then he describes it. If he passed by a verse that has tasbih, he would do tasbih. And if he passes by a verse that has a question, he asks, meaning he has a dua, asking Allah for something good, he'd ask Allah. If he passed by a verse seeking refuge, that has seeking refuge in it, with Allah from anything bad, anything evil, from hellfire, he would seek refuge with Allah from that. Then he made ruku'. So after reciting all those long surahs in one rak'ah, then the Prophet ﷺ made ruku', and he would say Subhan Rabbi al-Azim in his ruku'. And then Hudayfa, describing his ruku', he said, فَكَانَ رُكُوعُهُ نَحْوًا مِنْ قِيَامِهِ. His ruku', the Prophet ﷺ's ruku' was as long as his qiyam, about as long as his qiyam, him standing up reciting. SubhanAllah, look how many surahs he recited. He recited Al-Fatiha in his qiyam, in the first rak'ah, Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Baqarah, An-Nisa, and Ali Imran, all in one rak'ah. Imagine how long it would take him to recite all that. And he's not rushing, right? He's reciting and taking his time with the recitation, slowly reciting. And anytime he'd pass by anything, as we mentioned, tasbih, asking Allah, seeking refuge with Allah, he would stop and do that, during his recitation. So imagine how long that took. And then when he did ruku', his ruku' was about as long as his qiyam. So he had very long ruku'. Subhanallah. And doing tasbih, glorifying Allah in his ruku'. Hudayfa is saying his ruku' was about as long as his qiyam, close or as long as his qiyam, as his qiyam was, as his standing up in prayer and reciting was. Then he said Sami Allahu liman hamidah, stood up, and then he stood up for long, again making dua. And Hudayfa is saying that it was as close as he was in ruku'. His qiyam, standing back up from ruku', he stood there making dua, the Prophet ﷺ, just in qiyam, after he stood back up from ruku' and before going down for sujood, and it was as long, almost as long as, or close as in length as his ruku' was, as much as he spent ruku'. And as we mentioned, his ruku' was almost as long as, or about as long as his qiyam. Then he went into sujood. This is all still within the first rak'ah, subhanAllah. And then he said Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, and Hudayfa says again, فَكَانَ سُجُودُهُ قَرِيبًا مِنْ قِيَامِهِ. So, and his sujood was about as close or roughly the same length as his qiyam. So we see, subhanAllah, this is a forgotten sunnah. This is a sunnah, subhanAllah, that a lot of times is neglected and people don't practice it. Even, whether it's in the masjid, behind the imam, or on our own, even as long as our qiyam may be, and usually it's not that long, but even when it's long, we recite a lot of Quran, our ruku' and sujood are like this, very quickly. The sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, to take our time, and even in reciting, especially you're reciting on your own, voluntary prayer, take your time, recite, reflect and think about the meaning of the verses, of the words of the Quran, of the book of Allah, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make dua along the way, and when you go into ruku', take your time. Make your ruku' as long as or close to the length of your qiyam. And when you stand up from ruku', make that as long as your ruku'. And when you go into sujood, make that as long as or close to the length of your qiyam. That is how Hudayfa radiallahu anhu described the prayer of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if we stop and reflect, subhanAllah, and compare that to our own prayer, we see sometimes why we don't have khushu' in our salah. And if we want to regain that, then that's a good example for us to start following, inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khaira, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.